Hey there, welcome to Shadow Archives. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy true horror and unsettling stories. My wife's family carries a story that isn't a legend or a rumor whispered between classmates. It's something rooted in real loss, passed down from generation to generation. It happened in Spain in the early 20th century, in a rural area where land was everything. Life back then was simple in some ways and brutally hard in others. There were no quick emergency services, no modern investigations, no cameras. If something terrible happened, it unfolded in silence, and justice depended on the people around you. My wife's great-grandparents were guardians of a large piece of land owned by someone who didn't live there full-time. Their job was to manage it while the owner was away. They supervised workers, handled the animals, kept the fields running, and made sure everything stayed in order. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work and came with responsibility. In small communities like that, trust meant everything. The landowner trusted them to protect his property. The workers trusted them for wages and direction. They lived in a house on that land, surrounded by open fields and livestock. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Word traveled fast, but danger was not something people expected to walk through the front door. One morning, the workers had already left for the day. The men were out in the fields, tending to crops and animals. The house was quiet. My wife's great-grandmother was inside cooking lunch. Her daughters, who were no older than 7, were nearby. My wife's grandmother was only 1 year old at the time. In small farming communities, the rhythm of the day was predictable. Morning work, midday meal, afternoon labor. That predictability is part of what makes what happened next so horrifying. According to family history, the town's crazy man walked into the house. In many villages back then, there was often someone known as unstable or troubled. Mental illness was not understood or treated the way it is today. A person who behaved strangely might simply be labeled as mad and left alone unless they became disruptive. This man had that reputation. He entered the house carrying an axe. There was no warning. No argument described in the stories. He simply attacked. He struck my wife's great-grandmother in the head with the axe. He also killed the young girls. They were just children, barely old enough to understand the world around them. The 1-year-old baby, my wife's grandmother, was somehow not struck. Whether she was in a crib, in another room, or simply overlooked in the chaos, no one knows for sure, but she survived. When the workers and my wife's great-grandfather returned later, they found the aftermath. There are no dramatic embellishments in the way this story is told in the family. There is no need. The reality is devastating enough. They immediately knew who had done it. The man had not shown up for work that day. The axe used in the attack was identified as his. In a small rural town, tools were personal and recognizable. People knew each other's belongings. There was no modern police force with forensic teams the way we imagine today. Instead, the men of the community organized a search party. They went looking for him across fields, paths, and nearby woods. In places like that, people relied on each other for protection and justice. According to the story, he was never officially found. But when family members tell it, they add a quiet line. Don't go near that pond. It's said in a way that doesn't require explanation. In small towns, sometimes things are handled without records. A man who commits an act like that in a tight-knit farming community in the early 1900s might not face a formal trial. There may not have been paperwork or public announcements, but communities protected their own. The implication is clear. The pond holds an answer that was never written down. What makes this story different from a ghost tale or urban legend is that it isn't meant to scare for entertainment. It carries grief, It carries generational trauma. My wife's grandmother grew up without a mother and sisters because of that mourning. Her father lost his entire immediate family in one violent act. That kind of loss shapes a person's life forever. Or it also reflects the reality of mental illness in that era. A man described as crazy was likely untreated, misunderstood, and possibly dangerous long before that day. Rural Spain in the early 20th century did not have mental health systems. There were no psychiatric hospitals nearby in many regions, no structured intervention. People with severe conditions often wandered communities unchecked until something terrible happened. It's easy to focus on the violence, but what stays with me most when I hear the story is the silence afterward. The baby who survived, the father returning home to find his family gone, the workers standing in shock, the search through fields and along water banks. When something like that happens in a small place, it doesn't fade quickly. Every field holds memory, every path carries weight. Even decades later, the land would feel different. For my wife's grandmother, growing up knowing she had been in that house but somehow spared must have been complicated. Survivor's guilt is not a modern invention. Even if she was too young to remember the event consciously, she would have grown up hearing it, knowing she lived while her sisters did not. Stories like this don't need embellishment. They don't need glowing eyes or supernatural explanations. They are terrifying because they are human, because they show how fragile life was in isolated rural communities. Because they remind us that violence can appear without warning. The pond detail adds a chilling final note, but it's not supernatural. It suggests a kind of frontier justice, a community that decided to close the chapter quietly rather than wait for distant authorities who might never arrive. When I think about it, I don't picture horror movie scenes. I picture a farmhouse kitchen, a morning that began normally, a 1-year-old baby crying in another room, my men walking back from fields under the sun, unaware of what they were about to see. The scariest part isn't a ghost or a curse. It's how ordinary that day probably felt before it changed everything. In families, trauma doesn't disappear. It becomes part of identity. It's told carefully, sometimes with long pauses. It reminds younger generations where they came from and what their ancestors endured. And somewhere near a quiet pond in rural Spain, there is likely a story that never made it into official records, but has lived on in memory for over a century, not because it's a legend, but because it happened. My grandmother was born in a small village west of Moscow. It was not a famous place, not a strategic city, just one of many rural communities surrounded by forests and fields. When she told me stories about her childhood, they were usually simple memories about farming, winter snow, long walks to fetch water, and neighbors helping each other survive hard seasons. But there was one story she shared only a few times, and even decades later, her voice would change when she spoke about it. She was about 5 or 6 years old when the German army reached their village during World War II. By that point, the war had already reshaped millions of lives across Europe. The Wehrmacht had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, pushing rapidly eastward in what became one of the deadliest campaigns in history. Villages like hers, small and defenseless, were caught directly in the path of advancing troops. My grandmother described the day they arrived as loud and chaotic. She remembered the rumble of vehicles shouting in a language she did not understand, and adults moving quickly with fear written across their faces. For a child that young, the world shifts in strange ways during trauma. You may not understand the politics or the strategy, but you understand fear. You understand when the adults are no longer calm. Her family was living in a modest wooden house. Winters were harsh there, and survival depended on storing food and staying close together. At that time, she also had a baby sister who had been born only a few weeks earlier. The baby was fragile, tiny, wrapped in layers of cloth to keep warm. When the soldiers entered the village, violence followed. My grandmother never described everything in detail. She simply said they did the things soldiers did. In the Eastern Territories, that phrase carries enormous weight. Civilian executions, looting, destruction of homes, and brutality were tragically common. The Eastern Front was especially cruel. It was not only a military campaign, it was also driven by ideology and racial hatred. According to what my grandmother told me, soldiers entered their home after violence had already occurred in the village. Adults were forced outside. There was shouting, confusion, and terror. She remembered being pulled away from the doorway and not fully understanding what was happening. What she told next is the part that stayed with our family for generations. She said the soldiers brought a large rat into the house and placed it inside the baby's crib before leaving the infant alone. In her words, the rat was trapped there. The baby could not escape. The adults were prevented from entering. And in that sealed moment, fear, hunger, and cruelty intersected. My grandmother never described the aftermath in graphic detail. She did not need to. The implication was clear enough. The baby did not survive. It is difficult to process something like that. Even now, war stories are often told in terms of battles, generals, and troop movements. But in villages like hers, the war was not abstract. It entered homes. It touched cradles. It broke families in ways that statistics cannot capture. When she told me this story, she was already an elderly woman. Decades had passed. She had survived the war, rebuilt her life, raised children, and eventually grandchildren. But that memory remained sharp. Trauma, especially in early childhood, it does not simply fade. It embeds itself in the nervous system. It changes how a person sees the world. As I grew older, I began to study more about what happened on the Eastern Front. Historians have documented countless atrocities committed by Nazi forces in occupied Soviet territories. Entire villages were burned. Civilians were executed. Starvation and terror were used as tools of control. The ideology of the invading regime dehumanized Slavic populations, labeling them as inferior. That kind of belief makes cruelty easier. When people are seen as less than human, moral limits erode. Still, even knowing the historical context does not make the personal story easier to carry. I have sometimes wondered about memory and how it forms in children. She was 5 or 6 at the time. At that age, memories can be fragmented. Trauma can blur details. Some historians caution that stories passed down through generations can become shaped by fear, repetition, or misunderstanding. It is possible that certain details shifted over time. It is possible that some elements were misinterpreted in the chaos. But what is not in doubt is that the Eastern Front saw unspeakable acts against civilians, including children. There are documented accounts of brutality that defy comprehension. Whether every detail happened exactly as remembered or not, the environment she lived through was real and deadly. I also think about what it means for a child to witness or even sense that kind of event. Even if she did not see everything directly, the aftermath would have been clear. The silence in the house, the absence of a baby who had just been there, the grief of parents who could not protect their child. For a 5-year-old, that kind of loss is overwhelming. Survivors of war often carry a complicated relationship with memory. Some refuse to speak about it, others share only fragments. My grandmother did not tell the story often. When she did, it was not to shock us. It was to remind us that war is not a movie or a storybook. It is not glory. It is not simple heroism. It is destruction that reaches into the smallest spaces of family life. In the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, World War II is often remembered primarily through the lens of victory in Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany. There are memorials, documentaries, and school lessons that highlight courage and sacrifice. Those narratives are important, but they sometimes overlook the depth of civilian suffering in places like rural Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. Entire communities were erased. Families disappeared. The Eastern Front was one of the bloodiest theaters of the war. Millions of Soviet civilians died, some from direct violence, others from starvation, forced labor, or exposure. Villages like my grandmother's were caught between advancing armies and ideological hatred. What stays with me most is not only the cruelty but the resilience. Despite losing a sister in such a horrifying way, my grandmother survived. She grew up. She endured years of occupation, hunger, and uncertainty. After the war, she worked, married, and built a life. That strength does not erase the trauma, but it shows the human capacity to continue even after devastation. When she described her younger sister, she did not speak with anger. She spoke with sadness. It was as if that tiny life remained frozen in time, always a few weeks old in her memory. War stole not only a child, but also the future that child might have had. As someone who grew up far removed from that battlefield, I sometimes struggle to reconcile how ordinary modern life feels compared to what previous generations endured. We argue about politics, traffic, daily inconveniences. Meanwhile, only a few generations ago, families were fighting simply to survive occupation. It is also important to approach stories like this with care. They involve real suffering and real historical trauma. They are not meant to be sensational. They are reminders of what hatred and ideology can lead to when unchecked. Dehumanization is a powerful force. Once a group of people is labeled as inferior, cruelty can be justified in the minds of those who commit it. I think about how children experience war differently from adults. Adults understand the politics. Children understand only fear and loss. My grandmother likely did not know who the Wehrmacht was or what Nazism meant. She only knew that strangers arrived, violence followed, and her baby sister was gone. As the years pass and the generation that lived through World War II grows smaller, stories like hers become more fragile. Memory fades. Witnesses disappear. But it is important to preserve these accounts, not for shock value, but for historical understanding. The war on the Eastern Front left scars that are still visible in families today. Trauma can echo through generations. Children of survivors often grow up with a deep sense of caution, anxiety, or resilience shaped by stories of survival. Even when the physical war ends, its psychological impact can linger. When my grandmother shared this story, she did not end it with bitterness. She ended it quietly, as if she wanted us to understand the weight of history without being consumed by it. She wanted us to appreciate peace. She wanted us to know that safety should never be taken for granted. It is easy to reduce history to dates and battles, but behind every statistic is a family. Behind every campaign is a village, and behind every war story is a child who once stood in a doorway, confused and afraid, not yet understanding that the world had just changed forever. Her story is not just about cruelty. It is about survival. It is about memory. It is about the importance of remembering what unchecked hatred can do. And even now, decades later, when she speaks about that time, there is still a quiet pause in her voice. Not because she wants to shock anyone, but because some memories never fully release their grip. In In the early 1990s, when my wife was still a small child, her family went through something that shaped the way they viewed the world for years afterward. It was not the kind of story people tell lightly. Even now, when it comes up in conversation, there is still tension in her voice. It is one of those childhood memories that never fully fades because it was tied to fear, confusion, and the feeling that danger was always just outside the door. Her father had always been a social man. He worked hard, knew a lot of people, and had a wide circle of acquaintances. But sometime during that period, he became involved with a group of individuals who were not what they first appeared to be. At first, it seemed harmless enough. They were friendly, welcoming, and talked about spirituality in a way that felt unconventional, but not immediately alarming. They wore unusual symbols as jewelry, dressed in deep purple clothing, and spoke about ideas that sounded mysterious and secretive. Back then, in the early 90s, conversations about hidden groups or underground spiritual circles carried a different weight. Information wasn't as easily accessible as it is now. If someone claimed to be part of something esoteric, it could sound intriguing instead of dangerous. Over time, however, the tone changed. What began as casual association grew into something darker. Her father realized that the group was not simply interested in alternative beliefs or symbolic rituals. They were deeply involved in practices they openly described as satanic. This was not a casual, aesthetic, or rebellious statement. It involved structured meetings, symbolism tied to darker ideology, and behavior that made him deeply uncomfortable. He began to see things that unsettled him. The symbols were not random designs. They were intentional. The jewelry was worn as markers of belonging. The purple clothing, according to them, held meaning within their circle. See, conversations turned away from abstract philosophy and toward ritualistic practices that crossed moral lines for him. At some point, he understood that he had gone too far into something he did not want to be part of. He decided to leave. Leaving, however, did not feel simple, according to what my wife has shared. Once he pulled away from the group, things shifted. He began noticing familiar faces in unexpected places. The same car parked down the street more than once. The same individuals appearing at stores or near his workplace. At first, he questioned himself. Was he being paranoid? Was he imagining patterns where none existed? But the sightings continued. Soon he became convinced they were following him. He would drive somewhere and see a vehicle behind him that seemed to mirror his turns. He would arrive home and notice someone lingering at the edge of the property. He told his wife about it. She was frightened but tried to remain calm for the sake of the children. My wife was very young at the time. Her memories are fragmented, more feelings than clear images. She remembers tension in the house, whispered conversations late at night, doors locked carefully, curtains drawn tighter than usual. Then came the night that changed everything. The family had gone out together. It was supposed to be a normal evening. When they returned home, something was wrong immediately. From the driveway, they could see that windows were broken. Glass glittered across the lawn and driveway in the porch light. The front door was slightly open. Her father told everyone to stay back. When they entered the house, the scene inside was chaotic. Several windows had been smashed from the outside. Furniture had been knocked over, and there was blood on the floor, a significant amount of blood. Their dog had been inside the house. The dog was protective and territorial. It appeared that someone had attempted to break in, and the dog attacked them. There were signs of struggle. The intruder or intruders had likely fled quickly, injured. Police were called, reports were made, but no one was ever officially caught or charged in connection to the break-in. There were no clear fingerprints, no confirmed suspects, just broken glass, overturned furniture, and blood that did not belong to anyone in the family. After that night, fear became a constant presence. My wife's toddler sibling was so young at the time that the safest place they felt they could put them at night was in a car seat. The logic was simple and heartbreaking. If someone broke in again, they could grab the baby quickly and run. A car seat meant faster movement, less scrambling in the dark. No one slept well during that period. Every sound outside felt amplified. Every car driving past seemed suspicious. Her father continued to believe that the group he had left was responsible. In his mind, it was retaliation. He knew too much about them. He had seen what they were involved in. Whether that belief was entirely accurate or shaped by fear is something no one can say with certainty now. What is certain is that the threat felt real enough to uproot the entire family. Within a short time, they made the decision to leave the state entirely. It was not a slow, carefully planned move. It was urgent. They packed what they could and relocated to a different place where no one from that circle would know where they were. Starting over was not easy. Jobs had to be found, new schools arranged, a new home secured, but safety mattered more than comfort. For my wife, the emotional imprint of that time lasted far longer than the physical danger. When you are a child and your world suddenly shifts from normal routine to fear of being watched, it changes how you see security. Even decades later, she sometimes feels uneasy if someone unfamiliar lingers near the house too long. Broken glass, even in unrelated situations, makes her tense. It is important to consider the broader cultural context of the early 1990s. That period saw what is now often referred to as the Satanic Panic in North America. There were widespread fears about hidden cults, ritual abuse, and underground networks. Some of those fears were based on real criminal activity. Others were fueled by rumor, misinformation, and moral panic amplified by media coverage. In many communities, simply wearing certain symbols or dressing in dark colors could trigger suspicion. That does not mean her father's experience was imagined. There are indeed fringe groups that operate with extreme beliefs and secretive structures, but it does mean that fear during that era could intensify how events were interpreted. The broken windows and blood were undeniable. Someone entered that house, someone was injured by the dog. Whether it was connected to the group he left or a separate crime of opportunity is something that remains unresolved. But when someone already feels targeted, an unexplained break-in reinforces that belief powerfully. From a psychological perspective, when a person leaves a tightly bound group, especially one with strong ideological ties, they may experience heightened vigilance. Every coincidence can feel meaningful. Every unfamiliar face can look like confirmation of threat. That does not mean danger was not present. It means the mind, under stress, scans constantly for patterns. The decision to flee suggests the fear was overwhelming enough to override doubt. Uprooting a family is not done lightly. Today, when my wife reflects on it, she does not focus on the symbols or the clothing. She focuses on the feeling in the house after that night. The way her parents' voices changed. The way the dog would bark at small noises. The way her siblings slept in that car seat as a precaution. Childhood safety is built on the belief that parents can protect you. When parents are visibly afraid, that sense of security cracks. Over time, the fear softened. In the new state, nothing followed them. No strange cars, no broken windows. Life slowly normalized. Her father avoided groups that felt secretive or extreme. He kept a smaller circle. He remained cautious. As adults, looking back, we try to balance the emotional truth of what happened with rational analysis. There was a group with unusual beliefs. There was a break-in involving real damage and blood. There was fear significant enough to move states, but there was never official proof tying everything together. That ambiguity is often what makes stories like this linger. Not knowing can be more haunting than confirmation. What stays strongest in memory is not the idea of a cult in purple clothing. It is the image of a toddler sleeping in a car seat because the family believed they might need to run at any moment. It is the sound of glass crunching under shoes as they entered their own home. It is the way trust in surroundings can evaporate overnight. Now, decades later, the story is less about Satanism and more about vulnerability. It is about how easily a family's sense of normalcy can be disrupted. It is about how fear, once introduced into a home, takes time to leave. Whether the group truly stalked her father or whether the break-in was a separate act that fit into an existing narrative of danger, the impact on the family was real. They felt hunted. They felt unsafe. They chose to protect their children the only way they knew how. And sometimes, that choice, to leave everything behind in search of safety, says more about the weight of the fear than any symbol or rumor ever could. There is a story that has circulated for years in different versions, sometimes told in fragments, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes mixed with other mountain tragedies. It is often referred to as the Russian Death March. Whether every detail has been preserved accurately over time is difficult to confirm, but the core of the story remains the same. A small group set out on what was supposed to be a normal mountain trip, and only one person returned alive. The story begins with a teacher who loved the outdoors. He believed in discipline, strength, and character building through nature. Mountain climbing, in his view, was not just a sport, but a way to teach resilience. He organized an expedition with a group of students. There were 7 of them in total. They were not reckless thrill seekers. They had trained. They had planned. They had checked weather reports. It was meant to be a controlled adventure, something challenging but manageable. The morning they began their ascent was described as sunny and calm. The sky was clear and there was no immediate sign of danger. In mountainous regions, however, weather can change without warning. Forecasts are not always reliable. Conditions that seem safe at the base can turn deadly higher up. As the group climbed, clouds began to gather. Wind picked up. Snow started to fall in thick sheets. What had been a pleasant climb quickly turned into a fight against nature. Visibility dropped. The temperature plunged. Snowstorms in high elevations can disorient even experienced climbers. Landmarks disappear. Trails become buried. Sound carries strangely. They pressed on, perhaps believing the storm would pass quickly. Turning back in harsh weather can sometimes feel more dangerous than pushing forward. At some point, however, exhaustion began to take hold. Valentina, the only survivor, later described the air feeling strange, thin, heavy at the same time. Breathing became difficult. One of the students, a boy named Sasha, suddenly collapsed. At first, the others thought he had simply slipped or fainted from fatigue. They rushed to lift him. He regained consciousness briefly, only to collapse again. When they tried to help him a second time, something changed. According to the story, Sasha began bleeding from his nose, then from his eyes, then from his ears. He started frothing at the mouth. Panic spread instantly. None of them understood what was happening. Now, there had been no visible injury that could explain such symptoms. There had been no fall from a great height, no obvious trauma. The others stood frozen for a moment, shocked by what they were seeing. Before they could fully process it, another member of the group staggered and dropped to the ground. Then the teacher himself fell. The pattern repeated. Bleeding from facial openings. Collapse. Silence. Valentina watched in disbelief as one by one her companions fell. The snow around them was no longer pure white. It was stained dark in places. The wind howled around her, and the world felt unreal. In some versions of the story, she expected the same fate at any moment. She braced herself for dizziness, for pain, for the sensation of something tearing inside her, but nothing happened. She remained standing while the others lay motionless. Fear replaced shock. Instinct took over. She began walking down the mountain alone. Every step must have felt like a gamble. She did not know what had caused the others to die. She did not know if she would suddenly collapse as well. The snow was deep. The wind was still strong. Navigating downward without clear visibility is dangerous even in calm weather. At one point, she reportedly felt something strange in her own body, a sensation in her head, a pressure behind her eyes. She believed for a moment that she too was about to start bleeding, but it did not happen. She kept moving. Eventually, she reached lower ground and was found. Rescue teams later returned to the site where the group had been. The bodies were recovered. The official explanations in stories like this vary depending on who is telling it. Some claim it was a rare atmospheric phenomenon. Others suggest toxic gas trapped near the mountain surface. Some speculate about military testing in remote areas, as parts of Russia have long histories of restricted zones. There are also medical explanations that, while less dramatic, may make more sense scientifically. High-altitude sickness can become severe and life-threatening. Conditions such as high-altitude pulmonary edema and high-altitude cerebral edema can cause confusion, collapse, and fluid leakage. In extreme cold, frostbite and tissue damage can create bleeding from the nose. Severe hypothermia can lead to disorientation and loss of coordination. In rare cases, sudden pressure changes or undetected internal injuries can cause bleeding from multiple areas. There is also the possibility of exposure to a toxic substance. Certain gases, if released naturally from the ground, can accumulate in low-lying areas. Carbon monoxide, for example, is odorless and deadly. Volcanic gases in some mountain regions have caused unexplained deaths before. If a pocket of gas was released during the storm, those closest to it could have been affected more severely. But the bleeding from eyes and ears detail is what makes the story feel almost unreal. That symptom is often repeated in urban legends to amplify horror. In reality, massive internal trauma or severe decompression injuries can cause blood to appear from facial openings, but such events usually involve explosions or rapid pressure shifts. Stories passed down over time tend to intensify. One person describes a nosebleed, another adds that there was blood near the eyes. Eventually, it becomes bleeding from every opening. Memory is not static, it reshapes itself with retelling. What remains constant is that 7 people went into the mountains and only 1 returned alive. Valentina's survival would have carried its own burden. Survivor's guilt is powerful. Watching friends and a mentor die suddenly and inexplicably can leave deep psychological scars. Questions linger. Why them? Why not me? Did she walk in a slightly different position? Was she standing a few feet away from whatever caused the others to collapse? Did the wind shift at just the right moment? In tragedies like this, small differences can determine life or death. Mountain disasters have happened before and will happen again. Weather changes rapidly. Equipment fails. Human bodies react unpredictably to altitude and cold. Even trained climbers sometimes underestimate conditions. The emotional power of this story comes from its suddenness. One moment, a group is climbing together. The next, they are gone. No prolonged illness. No warning signs that anyone could clearly interpret in time. For audiences in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, stories like this may echo other well-known mountain tragedies. The wilderness has always held a dual identity. It is beautiful and peaceful, but it is also indifferent to human life. It does not negotiate. It does not pause for explanation. In Russia, especially during certain decades, official investigations into remote tragedies were not always transparent. This lack of information often fueled speculation. When people do not receive clear answers, they create their own. Rumors fill the gaps. The image of a lone survivor walking down a snow-covered mountain while expecting to die at any second is haunting. It captures the raw vulnerability of being alone in extreme conditions. The sound of wind, the crunch of snow under boots, the silence where voices once were. Whether every detail happened exactly as described, or whether parts of the story grew more dramatic over time, the core truth remains sobering. Nature can shift from calm to lethal within hours. Human plans can collapse without warning, and sometimes survival depends on factors too small to see. Valentina's name remains attached to the story because she walked away when no one else did. She carried the memory of that day for the rest of her life. For her, it was not a legend. It was not a mystery story shared online. It was the moment her world changed forever. The mountains do not explain themselves. They do not clarify what happened. They hold their secrets under layers of snow and wind. And sometimes all that returns from them is one person, walking alone, carrying questions that may never fully be answered. Not far from the town where I grew up, there is another small community that people still talk about in hushed voices. It is the kind of place you can drive through in a few minutes without realizing you have crossed into it. There is no large welcome sign, no busy main street, no shopping center that would catch your eye. If you blink at the wrong time, you might miss it completely. But if you slow down and really look, you notice something strange. It feels unfinished, forgotten. Like time stepped away and never fully came back. The first time I drove through it, I was still young. I remember looking out the window and asking why it looked so abandoned. Houses stood far apart from each other, some with broken windows or sagging roofs. Empty lots sat where buildings clearly used to be. Rusted vehicles were parked in yards as if they had been left there years ago. Tires were stacked against fences. Pieces of old machinery lay half buried in tall grass. It did not look like a ghost town exactly. People still lived there, but it looked like a place that had slowly given up. The adult I was with that day told me a story that I did not forget. According to local legend, years ago there had been a priest who served at the small church in that town. Every Sunday, he stood inside the church, ready to teach the Bible and welcome anyone who came through the doors. But the story says that no one came. The townspeople, for reasons no one fully explains now, treated him poorly. Some say they mocked him. Others say they ignored him completely. In small towns, isolation can be heavy. A church without a congregation feels like a symbol of rejection. The legend says that after enduring years of being dismissed and disrespected, the priest finally reached a breaking point. One day, he climbed up to a cliff overlooking the entire town. From there, he could see the rooftops, the roads, the small cluster of buildings that made up the community. Standing there, according to the story, he prayed not for forgiveness, not for patience, but for a curse to fall upon the town. Whether he truly did this or whether the story grew larger with each retelling is something no one can confirm. But what happened next became part of the legend. Within that same month, the town's fire department burned to the ground. It was not a small accident. The building was destroyed. People were shaken. There were no reported casualties, but the loss of the fire department was a major blow to a small community. Fire departments are more than buildings. They represent safety and quick response in emergencies. Losing it felt symbolic. Then, about a month later, the town's only school burned down as well. Again, there were no deaths, but the damage was severe. The cinder block remains of the school still stand today, a hollow shell of what used to be a place filled with children's voices. For years afterward, people would drive by and see the empty structure, its windows gone, walls darkened by smoke. It became a physical reminder of something that had gone wrong. After the fires, things began to change slowly. Families started moving away. Some left because the school was gone and they did not want their children traveling far for education. Others left because businesses struggled without community infrastructure. Once people start leaving a small town, it creates a ripple effect. Fewer customers for local shops, fewer volunteers for services, fewer reasons for new families to move in. Those who stayed behind began to live differently. Without strong community structure, maintenance often falls by the wayside. Yards that were once neat became cluttered. Old vehicles that might have been repaired or sold were simply parked and left. Tires, scrap metal, broken appliances, they began to accumulate. Over time, the town took on the appearance of a junkyard that people happened to live in. As a child, the curse explanation made sense in a simple way. 2 major buildings burned within months of each other. The town declined. It felt like cause and effect. The priest prayed. The town suffered. The story connected the events neatly. But as I grew older, I began to see how easily human beings create narratives to explain tragedy. Small towns are fragile ecosystems. If a fire department burns down, it is often because of aging wiring, lack of funding, or an accident. If a school burns down shortly after, it could be coincidence, faulty infrastructure, or even arson unrelated to any curse. In struggling communities, buildings are sometimes not maintained properly. Fire safety systems might be outdated. Insurance battles can delay rebuilding. When 2 disasters happen close together, people search for meaning. It is emotionally easier to believe in a curse than to accept that neglect. Poor funding or bad luck can unravel a town. There is also something deeply human about turning a rejected priest into a symbol of divine justice. If a town truly did treat him badly, the story becomes a moral lesson. Be kind. Do not mock faith. Do not reject those who serve you, otherwise consequences follow. Stories like that are powerful in rural areas. They reinforce social behavior. They warn against cruelty. The reality of economic decline, however, is often less dramatic and more complicated. Once the school burned, families may have relocated for practical reasons. With fewer children, funding drops further. With fewer businesses, jobs disappear. Property values fall. When property values fall, maintenance declines. When maintenance declines, outsiders see decay and avoid investing. It becomes a cycle. Old vehicles and junk in yards are often signs of limited resources rather than laziness. If someone cannot afford disposal fees or repairs, items remain where they are. Over time, those items shape the appearance of the town. When I drive through that place now, years later, I can see small signs of recovery. A house freshly painted, a new roof installed, a small convenience store reopened. But it is nowhere near what people describe it once being. According to older residents, there was a time when the town was lively. Kids played in the schoolyard. Community events filled the church. Lawns were trimmed. People waved from their porches. The remains of the burned school still stand as a reminder. Some people say it should be demolished. Others think it should remain, a monument to the past. When sunlight hits the cinder blocks just right, you can almost imagine the shape of the building as it once was. The curse story continues to circulate. Teenagers repeat it during late-night drives. Locals share it with newcomers. It has become part of the town's identity. But I sometimes wonder if the real lesson is less about curses and more about community. When people withdraw from one another, when institutions crumble and are not rebuilt, when neglect replaces care, decline can happen quietly and steadily. No supernatural force required. At the same time, there is something haunting about places that feel paused in time. Driving through that town still gives me a strange feeling. The silence is different. The space between houses feels wider than it should. Even if you do not believe in curses, you can sense that something shifted there long ago. It reminds me how quickly stability can change. A fire, another fire, a few families move away, then a few more. Years pass, and what once felt permanent becomes fragile. Legends often form around loss. They help people cope. Saying a priest cursed the town gives the chaos a clear beginning. It makes the decline feel like a story with a moral rather than a slow unraveling caused by many small factors. In the United States and Canada especially, there are many small towns that have faced similar declines without any curse attached. Factories close, schools consolidate, young people move to cities for work. Main streets empty out. What remains can look abandoned even if life continues quietly inside homes. The town near where I grew up is not entirely gone. People still live there. Children still ride bikes along cracked sidewalks. Dogs still bark behind chain-link fences, but it carries the weight of its past. Whenever I pass through, I think about how stories shape our understanding of places. A burned school can become a symbol. A lonely priest can become a legend. A community's slow decline can be wrapped in a tale of supernatural punishment. Maybe the truth is simpler and harder at the same time. Maybe the town suffered from neglect, bad luck, and economic strain. Maybe it also suffered from people turning away from one another. In small communities, connection is everything. When it weakens, the structure of the place weakens too. Whether or not a curse was ever spoken on that cliff, the real damage came from what followed: loss, departure, and time. And sometimes that is enough to change a town forever. In the early 1900s, around the 1910s, the area where I live now looked completely different. What is a public beach today used to be farmland and open countryside. There were no paved roads, no parking lots, no lifeguard towers. Instead, there were dirt paths, wooden fences, railway tracks running close to the water, and small farmhouses scattered across the land. One of those farmhouses belonged to a woman people still remember as Mrs. Black. Very little is written about her in official records. Most of what survives comes from local stories passed down through families. In small communities, especially in the early 20th century, personal struggles were rarely documented in detail. Mental health, in particular, was something people spoke about quietly, if at all. Mrs. Black lived alone on her farm near a pond. The pond sat not far from a railway line that cut across the landscape. Today, that same stretch of land is part of a beach area where families gather in summer. Back then, it was quiet and isolated. The sound of passing trains would have echoed across open fields, but otherwise it was a place of stillness. According to the stories, Mrs. Black struggled with deep depression. In the 1910s, depression was not treated the way it is now. There were no modern antidepressants, no widespread access to therapy, and very little public understanding of mental illness. People were often expected to endure their suffering in silence. Women in rural areas, especially those living with isolation, could carry heavy emotional burdens without support. One day, construction workers were nearby, likely working on railway maintenance or related projects. From what has been told, they noticed a woman walking toward the pond. At first, nothing about it seemed unusual. It was not uncommon for people to walk near water especially on warm days. But then they saw her begin removing her clothes. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped into the pond. At that moment, the workers understood what was happening. By the time they reacted, it was too late. The pond, which might have seemed shallow from the edges, could deepen suddenly. Water can be deceptive. A few steps too far, and footing disappears. They watched as she moved further in until she was submerged. In those days, emergency response systems were minimal. There were no rapid rescue teams on standby. By the time anyone could reach her, she had drowned. The story stayed in the community for decades. Some say the pond never felt the same afterward. Others say trains passing by at night sometimes carried a strange echo across the water. Of course, stories tend to grow over time, but at the center of it all was a woman who likely felt alone and overwhelmed in an era when few resources existed to help her. When you think about the early 1900s, it is easy to romanticize the past. People imagine simpler times, quiet farms, and close-knit communities. But life could also be brutally isolating. If someone struggled mentally, there were few places to turn. Mrs. Black's story is not about haunting or mystery. It is about loneliness, untreated depression, and a tragic decision made in a moment of despair. The second story from that same general area is very different but just as tragic. There were two brothers, identical twins. Growing up near water and bridges, they did what many young people in the area did during hot weather. They jumped off a low bridge into the water below. It was a common thrill. The bridge was not extremely high, but it was high enough to feel daring. Underneath it was a stretch of water that appeared deep enough to land safely. The problem was visibility. From the top of the bridge, you could not clearly see the bottom. The water surface often reflected light, making it difficult to judge depth or spot submerged rocks. But familiarity breeds confidence. If others had jumped and come out laughing, it felt safe enough. One of the twins jumped multiple times. He had likely done it before. Each time he climbed back up, laughing, shaking water from his hair, ready to go again. The other twin may have jumped too, but accounts are unclear. What is certain is that one of them went up again for another leap. This time, something went wrong. When he hit the water, he struck his head on a rock below the surface. The impact knocked him unconscious. In water, losing consciousness is often fatal. Without the ability to move or swim, the body sinks. From above, everything may have looked normal at first. A splash, ripples spreading outward. But when he did not surface quickly, concern would have set in. Panic likely followed. Search efforts began, but water can conceal a body easily. Depending on depth and currents, recovery can take days. In this case, the body was not found for about a week. Imagine being the surviving twin, identical in appearance, born together, raised together, sharing friends, habits, and memories. And suddenly one is gone, not from illness or war, but from a moment of misjudged depth. The area around that bridge gained a reputation afterward. Some people avoided jumping there. Others continued, believing accidents happen only once. Over time, warning signs may have been added. But at that time, awareness about water safety was not as developed as it is today. Both of these stories reflect something common in early communities: how quickly life could change. There were no protective barriers along many bridges, no fencing, no clear depth markers, no widespread mental health support. The risks that feel obvious today were often overlooked or misunderstood. When I think about Mrs. Black walking into the pond, I imagine the silence of early morning or late afternoon, the still water reflecting sky, the distant sound of a train approaching. I imagine workers noticing something unusual but not yet understanding its meaning. When I think about the twin hitting his head, I imagine sunlight glinting off water, friends calling out encouragement, laughter turning to confusion, then fear. Neither story involves ghosts or curses. They involve human vulnerability. In the United States and Canada, many towns have similar stories buried in their local history. A farmer who walked into a river, a young person who misjudged a dive, a bridge that claimed a life. These events become part of community memory, sometimes softened over time, sometimes dramatized. Water in particular has always held a dual nature. It can be peaceful and inviting, but it can also be unforgiving. Depth is not always visible. Rocks shift, conditions change. Mental health, too, has a dual history. In the early 1900s, depression was often described as melancholia or simply sadness. People were told to pray, work harder, or keep quiet. Many did not receive compassion or care. Mrs. Black's story may not have been about weakness. It may have been about a system that did not know how to help. The twin story may not have been about recklessness. It may have been about youthful confidence and lack of awareness about hidden danger. Both stories remain part of local lore. When people walk the beach today, they likely do not think about the farm that once stood nearby or the railway workers who witnessed tragedy. When teenagers stand on bridges during summer afternoons, they probably do not know about the boy who hit his head beneath the surface. Time changes landscapes. Farms become beaches, dirt paths become paved roads. Bridges are reinforced or replaced, but the past lingers quietly beneath modern life. I often think about how different those times were. So no cell phones to call for help instantly, no rapid response dive teams, no community mental health centers. Survival depended heavily on luck, proximity, and the kindness of neighbors. In the end, these stories are not about the supernatural. They are about how fragile life can be. A single step into deeper water, a single jump misjudged, a single moment of despair. Over a century later, the pond and the bridge may still exist, though they likely look different now. The people sunbathe on the beach where farmland once stretched. Children splash in water that once held sorrow. Trains still pass by, but most riders do not know the history of the land beside the tracks. And maybe that is how it always is. Places carry memories long after people move on. The landscape changes, but stories remain, whispered from one generation to the next, not to frighten, but to remember. When I was 15 years old, something happened that I still cannot fully explain, even now in my 30s. I have replayed it in my mind countless times, trying to separate memory from imagination, emotion from fact. The older I get, the more I question it, but the details remain vivid in ways that are hard to ignore. It happened at a gathering at my dad's side of the family. I remember the house clearly. It was one of those older family homes that had been the center of birthdays, holidays, and arguments and long conversations for decades. The furniture was heavy and dark. The air always smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. That night, there were a lot of relatives there. Laughter echoed from the kitchen. Music played somewhere in the background. Adults were talking loudly, and younger cousins were running around between rooms. At some point, I stepped away from the noise. I do not remember exactly why. Maybe I was bored. Maybe I just needed quiet. But I remember walking down the hallway toward one of the back rooms. That is when I saw my grandfather. He was sitting alone, or at least that is how I remember it. He looked calm, focused. He motioned for me to come inside. I had always been curious about him. He was not the type to talk much at family gatherings. He kept to himself most of the time. So when he actually called me over, I felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. Inside the room, he showed me a thick book. It was heavy, bound in something dark and worn. When he opened it, the pages were filled with photographs. They were black and white, some in faded light brown tones like old Polaroids. The images were graphic. I remember feeling sick almost immediately. My stomach tightened. My throat felt dry. The pictures showed people who had clearly been hurt. Some were injured in ways I had never seen before. He told me they were victims of witchcraft. He spoke with certainty, like he believed every word he was saying. He described rituals, accusations, punishments. Some pages included written instructions, detailed descriptions of interrogation tactics. I remember one method he called the spoon method, where fingernails were removed. The idea alone made my hands ache just hearing about it. At 15, I was not prepared for that kind of content. I had never seen anything like it in real life. Even horror movies had not exposed me to that level of brutality. I felt dizzy, but I also felt pulled in. It was like I could not look away. He explained things calmly, almost academically, as if he were giving a lesson. I do not know how long we were in that room. Time felt strange. The noise of the party faded in the background. It was just him and me and those images. Then my dad appeared in the doorway. He looked angry, not confused, not surprised. Angry. He said sharply, "Let's go." I told him I would be there in a minute, that I was talking to Grandpa. But he repeated himself more firmly. So I left the room and followed him. I remember glancing back once. I cannot clearly remember if my grandfather was still sitting there or if the room already felt empty. We went home shortly after that. My dad did not explain why he was upset. I did not ask. Something about the way he reacted made me feel like I had done something wrong, even though I did not know what that was. Life moved on. Years passed. I grew up, went through my 20s, built my own life. But that memory stayed with me. It was not like a dream that fades with time. It stayed sharp. The weight of the book in my hands, the grainy photographs, the calm tone of his voice explaining torture methods. About 6 years ago, when I was around 34, my mom was still alive, but not in the best health. One evening, I decided to bring it up. I wanted clarity. I wanted to understand what I had experienced. I told her about that night at the family gathering. I described the room, the book, the photographs, the conversation. As I spoke, I noticed her face change. She went pale. At first, I thought she was confused. Then she let out a small, uneasy chuckle, the kind people make when they do not know how to respond. It was not a happy laugh. It was nervous. She called out to my dad from across the living room and told him to come over. She repeated what I had just told her. I watched both of them closely. My dad did not look amused. He did not look angry either. He looked serious. Then he said something that made the room feel smaller. He told me that the gathering I remembered was not just a party. It had been a farewell gathering for my grandfather. He said my grandfather had died 1 week before that night. I remember feeling like the air had been pulled from my lungs. My mind tried to reject what I had just heard. That could not be right. I had seen him. I had spoken to him. I had touched that book. I remembered the texture of the pages, but my dad was firm. He insisted that my grandfather had already passed away before that gathering. The event was meant to honor him, to bring family together one last time in his memory. I did not know what to say. Part of me wanted to argue. Another part of me felt frozen. If what they were saying was true, then who had I spoken to? Where had that book come from? Why did the memory feel so physical and real? Over the years since that conversation, I have tried to examine the experience from different angles. Memory is not perfect, especially when formed during adolescence. Memory can be influenced by emotion, suggestion, and environment. At 15, surrounded by family, in a house filled with stories and old objects, is it possible I misremembered something? Is it possible I saw old photographs somewhere else and attached them to him in my mind? The human brain is powerful. It can create detailed scenes that feel as real as lived experience. When we are young, especially during emotionally charged events, the line between imagination and memory can blur. If I knew my grandfather had recently died, perhaps my mind constructed a final conversation as a way to process grief. But the detail of the book still bothers me. The weight of it, the smell of the pages, the sharpness of the images. Another possibility is simpler. Perhaps I did speak to someone that night, but my memory assigned his face to my grandfather over time. Family gatherings are full of older men who can look similar. In the years after, my mind could have reshaped the scene, placing my grandfather in the center. There is also the uncomfortable truth that sometimes families do not tell children everything clearly. It is possible that the timeline was misunderstood, that he died days later, not before. Memory gaps in family narratives can create confusion. What unsettles me most is not the idea of seeing a ghost. It is the content of what I was shown, the violence, the detailed torture methods, the claim that the victims were connected to witchcraft. That is heavy material for a 15-year-old. Even now, I wonder whether those photographs were real, historical documents or something exaggerated in my memory. There have been times in history when people accused of witchcraft were tortured and killed. The methods described in old interrogation manuals were brutal. Fingernails removed, bones broken, confessions forced. If the book existed, it could have been a historical record. Perhaps my grandfather collected disturbing material. Perhaps he wanted to share something about history, though in a way that was not appropriate for a teenager. The brain, when confronted with trauma or shock, can freeze certain images in place. That might explain why the memory remains so vivid. The part that makes it feel supernatural is the timeline conflict. And being told years later that he had died before that night shakes the foundation of the memory. I do not claim to have answers. I have considered psychological explanations. I have considered family miscommunication. I have considered that grief and adolescence can interact in strange ways. When a loved one dies, especially during teenage years, the mind sometimes creates vivid experiences. Seeing them, speaking to them, it can feel real enough to convince you it happened physically. What I know is that the experience shaped me. It made me question perception. It made me realize how fragile memory can be. It also made me aware that not everything we remember is as fixed as we believe. I still sometimes think about that book, about the pages turning, about the photographs in faded tones. Whether it was a dreamlike creation of my mind or a misunderstood real event, it left an imprint. Now, at 34 and beyond, I no longer jump to supernatural conclusions. I lean toward psychological explanations because they are grounded in how memory works. But that does not erase the emotional weight of the memory itself. Some experiences stay with you not because they are proven to be paranormal, but because they challenge your understanding of reality. That night in that back room remains one of those experiences for me. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. There is a story I heard when I was younger that stayed with me for years. It sounds simple at first, almost like one of those old folk tales told in quiet rooms during family gatherings. But the more you think about it, the more layers it seems to have. It is not just a horror story. It feels like a story about fear, desperation, and consequences. The story begins with a husband and wife who lived together in a small home. The husband was known to be harsh and controlling. In some versions of the story, people say he was physically abusive. In others, they simply describe him as cruel and demanding. Either way, the home was not a peaceful place. The wife lived under constant pressure. Every day she tried to avoid angering him. Every word and action felt like it had to be carefully measured. One evening, the husband demanded that she cook him a special meal. He wanted liver soup. It was not a complicated dish, but it required one main ingredient, a fresh liver. The wife went to the kitchen and prepared the meal exactly as he asked. She cleaned the liver, cut it carefully, and placed it into the pot with herbs and spices. The smell filled the house. As she cooked, she decided to taste the soup to make sure it was seasoned properly. She took a small bite of the liver to test it, then another bite. In some tellings, it is said she was so hungry from neglect that she kept tasting it until she realized she had eaten the entire piece. In other versions, it is described as a mistake that happened slowly, almost without her noticing. When she finally looked into the pot, the liver was gone. Panic set in immediately. She knew how her husband would react if he discovered the main ingredient missing. Fear does strange things to people. It narrows their thinking. It pushes them toward decisions they might never consider in a calm moment. That same day, there had been a funeral in the village. A woman had died. In some versions of the story, the deceased was someone no one liked. In others, she was simply another member of the community. The wife remembered this funeral and, driven by desperation, went to the burial site. She dug into the fresh grave and removed the dead woman's liver. It is a horrifying image, but folklore often crosses into extreme territory to make a point. She brought the liver home, cleaned it as best as she could, and placed it into the pot. She finished cooking the soup and served it to her husband. He ate without questioning anything. Perhaps he complimented the taste. Perhaps he did not. The important part is that he consumed the meal without knowing where it had come from. That night, after the house had grown quiet and darkness settled into the corners of the rooms, something happened. The wife woke up suddenly. At first, she did not know why. The air felt heavier. The room seemed colder. Then she heard a voice. The voice asked slowly and clearly, "Who took my liver?" The wife froze. The words did not sound like they came from her husband. They did not sound like they came from outside the house. They seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere at once. Again, the voice demanded, "Who took my liver?" Her heart pounded in her chest. Fear gripped her throat. She knew exactly what the voice was referring to. The dead woman from the funeral had come back, searching for what had been stolen. The wife looked over at her sleeping husband. In that moment, she made a choice. Whether it was survival instinct or resentment built from years of abuse, she pointed at him and whispered, "It was him." As soon as she spoke those words, the room went dark. Some versions say the candles blew out. Others say the lamps shattered. The only sound left in the house was her husband's scream. The scream was described as long and filled with terror. Then it stopped. When morning came, the house was silent. In some versions, the husband was gone completely. In others, he was found lifeless. The wife survived. That is where most versions of the story end. When you hear it as a child, it feels like a simple ghost story. A vengeful spirit returns to claim what was taken. The guilty party is punished. But when you look closer, the story seems to carry deeper meaning. It reflects themes found in many traditional folk tales across Europe and North America. There is often an abusive figure. There is often a desperate act committed out of fear. And there is often a supernatural force that restores balance, though not always in a gentle way. In older societies, especially before modern law enforcement and social services, stories like this served as warnings. They warned against cruelty. They warned against disturbing the dead. They warned against moral corruption. The abusive husband represents unchecked power inside the home. The wife represents someone trapped by circumstance. The grave robbing act shows how desperation can push someone beyond moral boundaries. The returning spirit represents justice that human systems failed to provide. It is also interesting that the wife survives by shifting blame. In the story, she is technically the one who took the liver, yet the spirit punishes the husband. That suggests the story's moral center is not about theft from the dead, but about the husband's cruelty. The supernatural force may be seen as siding with the oppressed. Folklore often gives power to those who lack it in real life. In a time when women had limited legal or social protection from abusive spouses, stories like this could offer symbolic comfort. Even if real life offered no escape, the world of story allowed for justice. For modern audiences in the United States, Canada, or the United Kingdom, the tale feels dark and unsettling. Grave robbing and cannibal imagery are extreme, but many traditional stories contain such elements. Before stories were softened for children, they were often brutal and direct. There is also the psychological aspect. Hearing a voice in the night asking, "Who took my liver?" creates a chilling image. Darkness, guilt, and fear combine. Even without believing in ghosts, the emotional tension feels real. Some might interpret the spirit as a projection of guilt. The wife's mind, overwhelmed by fear and moral conflict, could create the voice internally. In that interpretation, the husband's scream could symbolize the collapse of an abusive system. But in folklore, explanations are not always literal. The supernatural is accepted as part of the narrative world. What makes the story linger is the final image, the lights going out, the scream echoing in the dark, the silence afterward. It does not tell us exactly what happened next. Did the wife live peacefully afterward? Did she regret her choice? Did the spirit leave satisfied? The story leaves those questions open. That openness is part of why it continues to be told. It invites imagination. It allows each listener to fill in the final details. Over time, versions of this story have appeared in different cultures with slight changes. Sometimes it is a heart instead of a liver. Sometimes the ghost repeats a different phrase, but the structure remains similar. A demand, a mistake, a desperate solution, a spirit returning, a scream in the dark. Stories like this survive because they tap into universal fears. A fear of the dark, fear of being powerless, fear of disturbing what should remain buried. But they also carry a quiet message. Cruelty inside a home does not go unseen forever. In the world of folklore, justice may come from unexpected places. Whether taken as a literal ghost story or a symbolic tale, it stays in the mind, not because of the gore alone, but because of the emotional truth underneath. Sometimes the scariest part is not the spear T asking for what was taken. It is the scream that follows. When I was a child, for years I lived with a fear that felt so real it shaped my nights. It started when I was very young and lasted until I was about 11. Almost every night I would fall asleep normally, only to wake up inside what felt like a copy of my own bedroom. That is the strange part. In the dream, I always knew I was in my room. The bed was in the same place. The dresser stood against the same wall. The door looked exactly the way it did during the day, but there was always something off. In the dream, I would be standing in the middle of the room holding a pistol. I had never touched a pistol in real life. No one in my house kept one. I had only seen them in movies. Yet in the dream, the weight of it in my hand felt real. My fingers wrapped around the grip. I could feel the cool metal against my skin. Even though I knew I was dreaming, I also felt alert, like something was about to happen. Then I would see it. My sister had an Elmo doll. It was a normal stuffed toy, bright red, soft, something you would expect to see in a child's room without thinking twice. But in my dreams, that doll did not stay still. It would appear near the dresser, then slowly crawl behind it, moving along the wall in a way that felt unnatural. Not walking, not hopping, crawling. It is difficult to explain how terrifying it felt in that moment. Even though I knew I was dreaming, the fear was physical. My heart would pound so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mouth would go dry. I would aim the pistol at the doll, but I could not bring myself to shoot. Something about it froze me. Then I would wake up. At least I thought I woke up. The room would look exactly the same as it had in the dream. Same dresser. Same shadows. Same door. I would sit up quickly and look around, trying to convince myself it had only been a nightmare. I shared the room with my brother at the time. He slept in the other bed. Almost every time this happened, I would reach over and shake him awake. I needed him to react normally. I needed him to say something normal. That was how I grounded myself. He would wake up annoyed and confused, asking what was wrong. I would tell him I had a bad dream. He would groan and tell me to go back to sleep. That reaction always helped a little. It made me feel like reality had returned. One night, though, something happened that blurred everything for me. After I woke from the dream and shook my brother, he responded as usual. He said it was just a dream. He told me to go back to bed. I lay down again, still shaken but trying to calm myself. That is when I saw it. The Elmo doll was in the room, not in the position it normally sat. It was near the dresser, and it moved. I remember staring at it, trying to tell myself I was still dreaming. It shifted slightly the way fabric might move if something inside it had life. I froze. I did not scream. I did not move. I felt trapped between sleep and wakefulness. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again because morning came like any other. The doll was back where it belonged. Everything looked ordinary. That experience repeated in variations over the years. The dream, the pistol, the crawling doll, the waking up and checking reality. I almost dreaded falling asleep because I knew the pattern might return. For a long time, I did not fully understand what was happening. As a child, it felt supernatural. It felt like something was crossing from dreams into real life. But as I got older, I began to learn about sleep disorders. There is a condition called sleep paralysis and another phenomenon known as false awakening. During false awakening, a person dreams that they have woken up. The environment looks identical to real life. You believe you are awake, but you are still dreaming. It can happen multiple times in a row, layering dream inside dream. There are also hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations. These are vivid visual or auditory experiences that happen as you fall asleep or wake up. They can feel completely real. People report seeing figures in their rooms, objects moving, shadows shifting. The brain, in that in-between state, blends dream imagery with the physical environment. When I learned about those things, a lot of my childhood fears started to make more sense. The pistol in my hand was likely my brain's way of giving me a sense of control in the dream. Even though I had never held one in real life, my mind constructed it as a symbol of protection. The crawling doll was probably tied to childhood fears. Toys are comforting during the day, but at night, when shadows stretch across walls, even harmless objects can look threatening. The night I thought I saw the doll move after waking could have been a false awakening. I may not have been fully awake yet. The brain can project movement onto objects in dim light. Small shifts in shadow can appear like motion, but at the time I did not know any of that. Instead, my brother and I did something that felt powerful. We decided to get rid of the doll. We dug a pit outside. I remember the dirt under my fingernails. We filled the hole with water and leaves, almost like we were trying to bury something alive. We threw stones on top before covering it with soil. In our minds, it was a ritual of sorts. We were eliminating the source of fear. After that, the nightmares stopped. Looking back, that makes psychological sense too. The act of burying the doll gave me closure. It created a feeling of safety and control. My brain no longer needed to replay the same dream. The symbol of fear was gone. As an adult now, I can see how intense childhood imagination can be. The brain at that age is highly active during REM sleep. Nightmares are common, especially during periods of stress or growth. The fact that it lasted until I was 11 might reflect a long phase of anxiety, or simply a pattern my brain fell into. There is also something important about shared space. Having my brother there helped anchor me to reality. His normal reaction reminded me that the world outside my head was stable. When I say I almost lost control every night, I am not exaggerating. The fear was overwhelming. It felt like my own room was no longer safe after dark. But over time, fear loses its power when examined. When I understand that my mind can create incredibly realistic experiences during sleep transitions, the memory becomes less supernatural and more human. Children often experience similar things, but do not always talk about them. Seeing figures in the room, hearing whispers, feeling like objects move. The brain, especially between sleep and wakefulness, can generate convincing illusions. Now, when I think about that red Elmo doll crawling behind the dresser, I do not see it as something evil. I see it as a symbol of a young brain trying to process fear in the only language it knew how. I no longer sleep with the lights on. I no longer shake someone awake to confirm reality. And I certainly do not keep childhood fears buried in the backyard. If anything, the experience taught me how powerful imagination can be, especially in the dark. What felt terrifying and unexplained at 11 now feels like a lesson in how the mind works. And sometimes, that understanding is more powerful than any nightmare. When I was younger, one of my close friends told me a story about his father that stayed with me for a long time. It was not told like a joke or a campfire story. It was told seriously with details and emotion. His father, who was normally calm and practical, would become visibly uneasy whenever he talked about it. His hands would shake slightly. His voice would lower. He would insist that what happened was real. And he would warn anyone listening to stay away from anything related to black magic. According to him, this happened when he was a teenager. He and a few friends had gone out one evening to a small restaurant. It was the kind of place that looked ordinary from the outside, nothing special. But when they walked in, it was nearly empty. No customers, no staff in sight at first. The atmosphere felt strange, though they could not immediately explain why. As they sat down, an old man appeared seemingly out of nowhere. None of them remembered hearing the door open or seeing him enter. He simply came toward their table. He looked thin, worn down by age, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to look right through them. He spoke softly but directly. He told them he had a book, a black magic book. He asked if they wanted it. At first, they thought he was joking. Teenagers are naturally curious, especially about things that feel forbidden or mysterious. One of them laughed and asked what was inside the book. The old man replied that it contained rituals, things that allowed a person to speak with the dead. That was enough to hook them. The idea of contacting spirits or crossing into the unknown is powerful, especially when you are young. It feels dangerous and exciting at the same time. Without fully thinking it through, they agreed to take the book. The old man handed it to them and left without another word. They flipped through the pages. The book contained strange poems, symbols, and instructions written in uneven handwriting. Some pages described rituals that required candles, specific words spoken aloud, and being in certain locations. One ritual stood out. It claimed that if you went to a graveyard at night, lit a candle near a grave, and recited a poem written in the book, you could speak to the dead person buried there. Teenagers often believe they are braver than they are. They decided to try it. That night, under darkness, they went to a nearby graveyard. Graveyards are already unsettling places at night. The silence feels heavier. The wind sounds louder. Shadows stretch in strange ways under moonlight. Every small noise feels amplified. They found a gravestone and placed a candle in front of it. One of them opened the book and began reading the poem aloud. The words were strange and rhythmic. As he spoke, the others stood around him, half laughing nervously, half waiting for something to happen. Then they heard a crow. The sudden cawing cut through the silence. It sounded close, louder than they expected. In the stillness of the graveyard, it startled them badly. Fear moved through the group instantly. Their imagination did the rest. The sound felt like an answer, like a sign that something had responded. Panic took over. They ran. They left everything behind. The candle, the book, even some of their personal items. They did not stop until they were far from the cemetery. By the next morning, when daylight made everything feel less threatening, they felt embarrassed. It had probably just been a bird, nothing more. Their curiosity, however, pulled them back. They decided to return to the graveyard to retrieve the book and the items they had dropped. When they arrived, the atmosphere felt different in daylight, less intimidating, more ordinary. But as they approached the grave where they had performed the ritual, they saw someone sitting there. An old man with a shovel. He was sitting calmly near the grave, as if waiting. The moment he noticed them, he stood up and shouted at them to leave. He told them they had disturbed him. His voice was angry, sharp, and full of authority. My friend's father said that in that moment, recognition hit him. The man with the shovel looked exactly like the man who had given them the book at the restaurant. Then he noticed something else. He looked at the gravestone beside the man. The photograph engraved on it showed the same old man. They did not argue. They did not question. They ran again, this time without looking back. They never returned to that graveyard. They never saw the book again. When my friend's father told the story, he was not smiling. He was not trying to impress anyone. He said he had no explanation for what happened. He swore it was true, and he always ended the story with the same warning: stay away from black magic. He believed they had touched something dangerous, something that was not meant to be disturbed. Now, looking at this story as an adult, there are different ways to understand it. First, the setting matters. Teenagers in an empty restaurant, approached by a mysterious stranger. It already feels cinematic, but it is possible the man was simply someone eccentric, perhaps someone who enjoyed playing with the imagination of young people. People sometimes create stories around objects to make them feel powerful. Second, graveyards at night heighten every sense. A crow's call can sound almost supernatural in the dark. When fear is already present, the brain connects random events into meaningful patterns. Hearing a bird immediately after reciting a ritual poem could feel like confirmation of something beyond explanation. The next day's encounter is the most unsettling part, but even that can have alternative explanations. It is possible that a groundskeeper or local resident was tending to the cemetery. If the grave belonged to someone recently deceased, perhaps a relative or worker was present. Memory can also shift over time. Faces can blur and merge in recollection. The old man at the restaurant and the man at the grave may not have been identical, but fear can solidify that belief. Another possibility is coincidence. The photo on the gravestone may have resembled the man they saw. Once the mind makes that connection, it feels undeniable. The shaking in his voice when he told the story may not have been proof of the supernatural. It may have been the lingering emotional impact of fear experienced at a young age. Intense fear, especially during adolescence, imprints deeply. Even decades later, recalling it can bring back the physical sensation. There is also the cultural layer. Many cultures warn against dabbling in black magic or attempting to contact the dead. Stories like this reinforce that warning. They act as cautionary tales. Whether literal or symbolic, they send a clear message. Some things are better left alone. For audiences in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, this story echoes many familiar themes. The mysterious stranger, the forbidden book, the midnight ritual, the graveyard confrontation. It has the structure of classic folklore. But what makes it powerful is not necessarily the supernatural element. It is the feeling of stepping into something unknown and losing control. It is the moment when curiosity turns into fear. Teenagers often test boundaries. They seek thrill and mystery. But sometimes even harmless exploration can spiral into overwhelming imagination. The mind is powerful. It can take a crow's cry and turn it into a voice from beyond. It can take a stranger's face and anchor it permanently to a moment of fear. At the same time, the story carries a simple lesson. Playing with ideas you do not fully understand can have consequences, even if those consequences are psychological rather than supernatural. Fear itself can be lasting, whether what happened that night was coincidence, imagination, or something else entirely. The impact on him was real. He carried it into adulthood. He remembered the way his heart pounded, the way the old man's voice sounded when he shouted, the way the photograph on the gravestone seemed to stare back at him. Stories like this live on because they sit in the space between belief and doubt. They do not offer clear answers. They offer atmosphere. They offer warning. And sometimes that is enough to keep people from opening certain books again. My mother used to tell a story about a close friend of hers who went house hunting with her husband many years ago. This friend was someone who had always been a bit different from everyone else in their social circle. From the time she was a small child, she claimed she could feel things that other people couldn't perceive. She spoke about negative energy as if it were a physical weight in the air, a thick and heavy pressure that would settle in certain rooms or around certain people. Most people dismissed her claims as a wild imagination or a desire for attention, but my mother always believed her because she had seen her friend become physically ill in places that were later revealed to have dark histories. She lived her life with a heightened sense of awareness, a constant internal radar that warned her when a space was unwelcoming or when the shadows held something more than just an absence of light. When it came time for her and her husband to look for a permanent home, she was naturally very cautious. They had looked at dozens of properties, but none of them felt right. Some were just old and drafty, but others had that familiar cold vibration that made her want to turn around and run back to the car. Her husband, on the other hand, was a very practical man who didn't believe in ghosts or energy. He was a man of facts and figures, and he was growing tired of the endless search. He wanted a place that was close to his work and had enough space for a workshop. He viewed her sensitivity as a hurdle to be overcome rather than a warning to be heeded. This tension had been building for months, turning their dream of a new home into a source of constant bickering and frustration. One Saturday afternoon, they pulled up to a house that looked perfectly normal from the outside. It was a large two-story building with a brick facade and a neat little garden. It sat on a quiet street where the trees were tall and the neighbors seemed to keep to themselves. On the surface, it was exactly what they had been looking for. But the moment the real estate agent turned the key in the lock and pushed the heavy wooden door open, The friend felt a wave of nausea hit her. It wasn't the smell of dust or old wood. It was a sudden, freezing draft that seemed to blow straight through her heart. She hesitated on the threshold, her hand gripping the doorframe so hard her knuckles turned white. The air inside felt stagnant and heavy, as if the house hadn't taken a breath in decades. Despite the screaming warning in her gut, she followed her husband and the agent inside. As they moved through the living room and toward the back of the house, she kept her eyes down, afraid of what she might see in the corners of the rooms. Her husband was already talking about where the television would go and how they could renovate the kitchen. He seemed energized by the space, his voice echoing loudly against the bare walls. But as they approached the center of the house, where a grand wooden staircase led up to the second floor, the friend's internal alarm went from a hum to a deafening roar. She felt a cold prickle on the back of her neck and an overwhelming urge to look up. She raised her eyes to the second floor landing, and for a split second, the world seemed to stop. Standing right by the heavy oak railing, staring down at them with an expression of profound, hollow sadness, was the silhouette of a woman. She wasn't a misty, translucent ghost from a movie. She looked solid and real, yet there was something fundamentally wrong with her presence. She wore a long, dark dress that seemed to absorb the light around her, and her hair was a tangled mess of shadows. The friend only saw her for a heartbeat before she vanished, but the image was burned into her mind. The woman didn't look like a threat. She looked like a witness, a silent observer waiting for something inevitable to happen. Terrified and shaking, the friend grabbed her husband's arm and told him they had to leave immediately. She tried to explain what she had seen and the crushing weight of the negative energy she was feeling, but he wouldn't hear it. He looked around the empty hallway and laughed, telling her that she was letting her nerves get the better of her. He was enamored with the house, convinced that it was the deal of a lifetime. He became uncharacteristically adamant, his voice taking on a sharp, desperate edge that she had never heard before. He told her flatly that if they didn't buy this house, he wasn't going to move at all. He said he was done searching and that this was the home they were going to live in, whether she liked it or not. The argument lasted for days, but eventually the friend gave in. She loved her husband and didn't want their marriage to crumble over what he considered to be a superstition. They signed the papers and moved in a few weeks later. From the very first night, the house began to change him. The man who was once practical and upbeat became withdrawn and moody. He spent hours sitting in the living room, staring up at the second-floor landing where the woman had been standing. He stopped working on his projects and stopped talking to his friends. The friend tried to convince him to leave, to sell the house and go back to an apartment, but he was like a man under a spell. He claimed he finally felt at home, even as the light seemed to drain out of his eyes and his skin took on a sickly gray pallor. The friend lived in a state of constant low-level terror. She never used the staircase if she could help it, and she avoided the second floor entirely. She could still feel the woman's presence, a lingering coldness that moved through the hallways at night. She would hear the sound of a long dress rustling against the floorboards and the faint, rhythmic creak of the railing as if someone were leaning against it. She tried to bring a priest in to bless the house, but her husband threw the man out, his anger sudden and violent. He had become a stranger in his own skin, his personality seemingly overwritten by the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the building. The house wasn't just a place they lived. It was a predator that was slowly consuming him. A month after they moved in, the final tragedy occurred. It was a night much like any other, quiet and still, with the moon casting long, distorted shadows through the windows. The friend had fallen into a light, restless sleep in the downstairs guest room, which was the only place she felt even remotely safe. She was jolted awake in the middle of the night by a sound that made her heart stop. It wasn't a scream or a crash, but a heavy, final thud that vibrated through the entire structure of the house. She knew instantly what it was, her internal radar screaming that the inevitable had finally arrived. She ran into the hallway, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and looked toward the center of the house. There, lying on the hardwood floor at the base of the grand staircase, was her husband. He had climbed to the second floor, stood at the exact spot where the friend had seen the glimpse of the woman, and jumped. The height shouldn't have been enough to be fatal under normal circumstances, but he had fallen in such a way that his life was extinguished instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating peace that felt like the house had finally finished its meal. As she knelt beside him, sobbing and screaming for help, the friend looked up at the railing one last time. For a fleeting second, she saw the woman again, but this time, the sadness was gone. The silhouette looked satisfied, as if a long-awaited task had finally been completed. The aftermath was a blur of police reports, whispers from the neighbors, and a crushing sense of guilt that would follow the friend for the rest of her life. The investigation revealed no reason for the suicide. There were no financial troubles, no history of depression, and no note left behind. To the outside world, it was an inexplicable tragedy, a sudden break in a man's mental health. But the friend knew better. She knew that the house had demanded a sacrifice, and that her husband's stubbornness had made him the perfect target. She moved out the next day, leaving most of their furniture and belongings behind. She couldn't spend another minute within those walls, fearing that if she stayed, the woman on the landing would eventually turn her gaze toward her. The house sat empty again for a long time after that, its dark reputation growing with every passing year. My mother said that her friend never fully recovered from the experience. She stopped talking about her gift and tried to live a life that was as ordinary and shielded as possible. But she never forgot the sight of her husband lying at the base of those stairs. She realized that the woman she had seen wasn't a warning for her to stay away, but a preview of what was to come. The negative energy she had felt wasn't just a vibe. It was a hungry, ancient thing that used the house as a trap. The fucked up stuff that people talk about isn't always a monster under the bed. Sometimes it's just a house that decides you belong to it. The story serves as a chilling reminder to trust your instincts, even when the people you love tell you that you're being irrational. There is a reason we feel fear, and there is a reason our bodies react to certain environments. The friend's husband thought he was being logical and strong, but his refusal to listen to his wife's intuition cost him his life. The house in that story is still out there somewhere, likely housing another family who thinks the flickering lights and the cold spots are just the quirks of an old building. They probably walk past the staircase every day, unaware of the silhouette that stands on the landing, waiting for the next person to look up and see the truth. I often think about the woman in the dark dress. Who was she, and why was she tied to that staircase? My mother's friend believed she was a previous occupant who had met a similar end, a ghost caught in a loop of her own tragedy, looking for someone else to share her fate. The idea of a haunting that requires a witness is a specialized kind of horror. It suggests that the dead aren't just lingering, they are active, seeking out the sensitive and the skeptical alike to join them in the shadows. The grand wooden staircase, which should have been a centerpiece of a happy home, became a gallows, a place where a life was ended because of a refusal to see what was right in front of them. The trauma of that month in the house changed the friend's perspective on everything. She realized that the safe world we think we live in is just a thin layer of paint over something much darker and more unpredictable. She learned that energy is real and that some places are simply incompatible with human life. The silence of the night no longer felt peaceful to her. It felt like a threat. Whenever she entered a new building, she would stand at the door and wait, listening not with her ears, but with that deep, internal sense that had warned her about the house. She never ignored that feeling again, no matter how much it cost her or how many people thought she was crazy. My mother always ended the story with a heavy sigh, a reminder that we should never take our safety for granted. We like to think we are the masters of our surroundings, but sometimes the surroundings are the masters of us. The friend moved far away from that city, eventually finding a small, modern home that felt light and airy, but she never forgot the weight of the darkness in that Portland-style house. She lived the rest of her days with a quiet, lingering dread, a ghost of a memory that she could never fully exorcise. The joyful life she had hoped for was replaced by a survivor's caution, a permanent scar on her soul that reminded her of the cost of staying when every fiber of her being told her to run. The house remains a dark spot in the memory of everyone who knew the couple. It is a story told to remind us that some bargains are not worth making, and that the price of a beautiful home can sometimes be higher than any bank account can pay. The man who jumped from the second floor is a part of the house now, another layer of energy added to the shadows, another reason for the next sensitive person to feel a chill when they walk through the door. The cycle continues, a silent, rhythmic pulse of tragedy that is hidden behind a neat brick facade and a quiet street. I hope that by sharing this, it makes people think twice before they dismiss the fears of their loved ones. We don't always have a logical reason for why we feel unsafe, but that doesn't make the feeling any less real. The world is full of things we don't understand, and sometimes the best thing you can do is just turn the car around and keep driving. The friend survived the house, but she lost her heart in the process. She is a witness to a horror that most people will never have to face. A woman who saw the end before it even began and was powerless to stop it. The silhouette on the landing is still there, I imagine, standing in the shadows of the second floor, looking down at the empty hallway. She is a reminder that some stories never truly end, and some ghosts never truly leave. They just wait for the next person to walk through the door, the next person to look up and see the darkness, and the next person to stay when they should have run. The fucked up stuff is always there, tucked away in the corners of our lives, waiting for the light to fade and the shadows to grow. This entire nightmare began in a place that is usually associated with boring layovers and overpriced coffee, not supernatural encounters. It started at a busy international airport, the kind of place where thousands of people cross paths every day without ever really looking at each other. My father was there, exhausted from a trip, just waiting for his flight to be called so he could come home to his family. He was standing near the gate, minding his own business, when his life intersected with a stranger who would change our family's history forever. A nervous African man approached him. This wasn't a casual encounter. The man looked like he was being hunted. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting around the terminal as if he expected someone or something to grab him at any second. In his trembling hands, he held an object wrapped in cloth which he hurriedly uncovered to reveal a wooden mask. It was a horned devil mask carved from dark, heavy wood. It was designed much like many other tribal African masks you might see in a museum or an anthropology textbook, but there was something distinctly unsettling about this one. The craftsmanship was undeniable, but the expression carved into the wood was twisted. It had sharp, jagged horns and a mouth that seemed to be frozen in a silent, hateful snarl. The eyes were just hollowed-out holes, but when my father looked at them, he felt a strange sensation, as if something was looking back from the darkness within the wood. The man was anxious, bordering on hysterical. He practically shoved the mask toward my father, begging him to take it. He didn't want money. He didn't want a favor. He just wanted to be rid of the object. He spoke in a rush, his voice cracking with fear, insisting that my father take it as a gift. My father is a logical, practical man. He had a very unsettling feeling about the mask the moment he saw it. Every instinct in his gut told him to walk away, to tell security, to do anything but touch that piece of wood. However, the desperation in the stranger's eyes was overwhelming. It was the look of a man who was drowning and reaching out for a lifeline. Reluctantly, and perhaps out of a sense of pity, or just to get the man to calm down, my father agreed. He took the mask. He didn't think too much of it at the time, trying to rationalize the strange interaction. After all, it was just a scary-looking mask. It was just a piece of wood. What could a scary-looking mask possibly do? He wrapped it up, put it in his luggage, and brought it home, unknowingly inviting a dark presence into our lives. When he arrived home, the mask was unpacked. My mother didn't like it either. She thought it was ugly and gave off a bad vibe. But my father laughed it off, trying to minimize the weirdness of how he got it. Since it was too disturbing to hang in the living room or the bedroom, they decided to put it in the spare room. At that time, this room was essentially a storage closet. It was empty except for stacks of cardboard boxes filled with old college textbooks, seasonal clothes, and other junk we didn't use. My father hammered a nail into the wall, hung the devil mask up, and shut the door. He expected the mask to do exactly what a mask is supposed to do: sit on the wall, gather dust, and maybe be a creepy conversation starter years down the road. Turns out, a scary-looking mask can do more than just sit on your wall. The activity didn't take long to start. It was only a few days later when the house was quiet. My parents were in the living room relaxing after a long day. I was just a baby at the time, asleep in my crib in another room. Suddenly, a deafening sound shattered the silence. It came from the spare room. It sounded like a violent crash, followed by the heavy thudding of objects hitting the walls and floor. It sounded as if someone had broken into the house and was tearing that specific room apart in a blind rage. My father's first thought was an intruder. He jumped up, heart pounding, and rushed down the hallway to the spare room. He expected to find a burglar or maybe a window that had shattered. When he reached the door, however, he found it locked. We had old-fashioned locks that required a key, and he knew for a fact that no one had gone in there. He pressed his ear to the door and could still hear the settling of dust, but the violence had stopped the moment he approached. He fumbled for the key, his hands shaking slightly, and unlocked the door. He threw it open and flipped on the light switch, bracing himself for a fight. The sight that greeted him was baffling. The room was empty of people. There was no intruder. The single window was painted shut and locked tight. But the room itself was a disaster zone. The heavy cardboard boxes, which had been neatly stacked against the far wall, were scattered everywhere. It wasn't just that they had fallen over. It looked as if a phantom force had picked them up and hurled them across the room. Some boxes were dented, others had burst open, spilling their contents across the floor. It was a scene of chaos. My father looked around wildly, trying to find a logical explanation. Then his eyes drifted to the wall. The mask was still there. It was hanging perfectly straight on its nail, in its usual spot. It hadn't moved an inch. It continued to lifelessly glare at him with those hollow eyes. The contrast was terrifying. The room was in shambles, yet the object that felt like the source of the energy was completely still. It felt like the mask was mocking him. My father stood there, freezing cold despite the warm house, realizing that the force required to throw those boxes was significant. No draft or earth tremor could have done this. It was violent. It was deliberate. My mother joined him at the doorway, and when she saw the room, she felt the same dread. They didn't need to say much to each other. The feeling in the air was heavy and oppressive. They both agreed right then and there that the mask was the cause. If a mask could do that just by hanging on the wall in an empty room, what else could it do? They looked at the boxes, then at the wall, and then their thoughts turned to me. I was a defenseless baby sleeping just a few rooms away. If this thing could throw heavy boxes with such violence, it could definitely hurt a child. The protective instinct kicked in immediately. They decided it should be immediately thrown in the trash before it could do anything worse. My father didn't wait until morning. He grabbed the mask off the wall, careful not to look into its eyes too long, and marched it out of the house. He walked to the large dumpster that served our complex and threw it in, burying it under other bags of garbage. He dusted his hands off, feeling a sense of relief. He thought that was the end of it. He thought he had protected his family. But as many people who have dealt with cursed objects know, getting rid of them is rarely that simple. The mask wasn't done with our family yet. Unfortunately, the mask had found its way to my uncle. My uncle was my father's brother, but they were very different people. My uncle was a skeptic, a joker, the kind of guy who laughed at ghost stories and thought superstition was for the weak. He came over to visit us a day or two later. While he was parking or walking by the dumpster, he spotted the mask. Maybe it had shifted, or maybe something wanted it to be found. He pulled it out, thinking he had struck gold. He brought it to our front door, grinning, holding the cursed thing in his hands. When my parents saw him with the mask, the color drained from their faces. They told him to put it back. They told him the story of the airport, the nervous man, and the boxes flying across the room. They explained that the thing was dangerous, that it carried a heavy, dark energy. My uncle just laughed. He thought it was completely silly that my parents were so afraid of a piece of wood. He mocked them gently, calling them paranoid. He ignored their warnings completely. To him, it was a cool, creepy artifact that he could hang in his own house to look edgy. Despite my father pleading with him to leave it in the trash, my uncle took it. He put it in his car and drove it to his home. I was never told exactly what my uncle was doing with the mask when he was keeping it for himself out of curiosity. I don't know if he displayed it prominently or if he kept it in a study, but as time passed, the dark influence of the object began to seep into his home. Enough time had passed for me to grow from a baby into a toddler who was starting to walk. That means the mask was in my uncle's house for over a year. During that year, things slowly began to fall apart for them. My uncle, perhaps because of his skepticism or stubbornness, seemed immune to the worst of it initially. But his wife, my aunt, was not so lucky. My aunt was a sweet, gentle woman. She had always been kind and mentally sharp, but after the mask had been in their house for a while, she began to change. It started with small things: nervousness, insomnia, a feeling of being watched. But then it escalated into pure terror. My aunt had begun to see horrible visions. She started seeing terrible things that I won't talk about in detail, partly because my parents never wanted to scare me with the gore, and partly because I think they were too disturbed to repeat them. But I know she saw figures that weren't there. She saw shadows moving on their own. She heard voices whispering hateful things when the room was empty. The tragedy was that nobody understood what was happening. To the outside world, and even to my uncle at first, it looked like a mental health crisis. She had undergone what many people saw as just her losing her mind. She would scream at the walls, crying that the devil was in the house. She became paranoid, unable to eat or sleep. The presence in the house, anchored by that mask, was driving her to the brink of insanity. My parents suspected the mask, and they told my uncle again and again to get rid of it. But by the time he started to believe them, the damage was done. My aunt's breakdown was absolute. She was eventually deemed a danger to herself because of the visions she was seeing. She got committed to a mental institution shortly after the worst episodes began. I was still very young, so I didn't understand why she disappeared. I just knew that one day she was there and the next She was gone. I never saw her again. I grew up always wondering what happened to her, only to learn later that she spent the rest of her life in care, never fully recovering from the darkness that had shattered her mind. My uncle was devastated. With his wife gone and his home feeling like a tomb, he finally realized that the silly mask was the source of all this misery. He finally got rid of the mask. I don't know the details of how he did it, whether he burned it, buried it, or chopped it into pieces. I just know he never touched it again after that. He never spoke about it. He became a changed man, living with the guilt that his skepticism had cost him his wife's sanity. It is quite possible that the mask did other things too, other violent physical acts like the boxes in our house, and that this is just the only thing that my parents included in the story or even know about. My uncle took the full extent of that horror to his grave. Now, as I tell this story years later, I know how it sounds. Say what you want about what I'm telling you. It sounds like the plot of a horror movie. I don't have any proof of it. I don't have the mask to show you, and I don't have medical records of my aunt's breakdown. But you have to understand something about my family. My parents are some of the most honest, down-to-earth people I know. They are not storytellers. They are not attention seekers. They would never lie about something like that, especially something that involves such a painful family tragedy. When they talk about the mask, they don't do it to entertain. They do it with a look of genuine fear in their eyes. And for something that I was never around to see with my own adult eyes, it is still scary to me. The thought that a cursed mask could actually do that, physically throw objects and mentally destroy a person, is terrifying. It chills me to the bone to think that I slept in the same house as that thing when I was a helpless infant. Like I said, this is not a joke. This will always be my reminder that the world is stranger and darker than we like to admit. There is a supernatural world above us, or perhaps beside us, and it follows rules we don't understand. If we mess with it, if we treat it casually or with arrogance, it will mess with us. The mask is gone, but the lesson remains. Some doors should never be opened, and some gifts should never be accepted. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.